Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Over the course of last month, I got to spend time building the hifi Credenza. This was a very long project, but it was also a very meaningful one. My clients are enthusiasts as well as owners of 1970s and 1980s hi-fi equipment. This is a passion that I share. And the second reason was being able to use spalted beech wood from Eastern Europe, more specifically my home country Romania. I've acquired this at a lumber store in the area, and I'll put the link below if you want to check it out. And I just hope that you can all join me in this episode as I'm walking you through the process of building the hifi Credenza. So my clients knew exactly what dimensions they wanted. 100 inches length by 22 inches deep. That was for the top. Then they wanted about 24 inches height of the overall credenza. One thing that we wanted to make sure is that the subwoofer was sitting on the ground. So came up with this design including a wing. Here you can take a better look at what I was designing. I wanted to make sure that this is going to be a strong unit. Their preference was to have a open back, which I totally understand. You want to be able to connect and disconnect things as you wish. Because of that, I basically made a back frame just like the face frame, and it's about 1.5 inches wide. And that gives it a lot of strength in combination with the walls and, of course, the dividers.
I would get me building the cabinets, and after installing the cabinets, I'm going to use
So what I'm doing here is trimming the boards to roughly 104 inches because the top is the longest, and I need to make sure that I had enough room for snipe to be trimmed off later. I will let the different outfits be a testament on how many days it took to mill the boards, to get them jointed and planed. Hey, I guess if you can do both at the same time, workout and woodwork out, why not? With boards like this one, I made sure that I was edge joining them, and then I just took them straight to the table saw. That gave me more manageable boards and enough to clear the joiner bed. If some of you all might wonder, why didn't I just make a sled for my planer? Well, it was just me being efficient with my time. In the future, I do plan to do some videos maybe with some updated shop jigs, but for this project I just needed to make sure that I was using my time wisely. Another good thing that came out of ripping the boards was they had a lot of stress, and when I ripped them, they would just bow out. And because I needed such long boards, I was forced to use that wood for the shorter components of the credenza. I also chose to use the table saw to resaw the boards to rough thickness before the top was going to be glued, because I wasn't going to take any chances with my 14-inch bandsaw. I did an attempt of resawing the boards, and it just wasn't going too smooth, and the speed rate was so slow when it came to feeding the boards in. So for this project, it was more suitable to use the table saw. The last step was to plane all the boards to thickness, and just like the joiner, this took about the same time, a few days. There you can take a look at the beautiful spalted beech wood. Started selecting some smaller 4/4 pieces for the sides and the inner dividers of the credenza, and repeated the process of trimming them to rough length. The joining here was a breeze. On these shorter pieces, I had this rhythm going on with the technique when you introduce a board right before the other one begins to leave the planer blades. Finally, I get to use some air and lay out my boards, trying to match the grain. This took a little while too, because I was undecisive, making sure that I had a pleasing look. I think at this point there was me and the ice cream truck in the neighborhood. Then it was back in the shop and time to start gluing the big boards. What I'm doing here is just marking them so I remember where I aligned them to match the grain. This was the board that made the top, and as you can see the spalting is all oriented in the same way. I guess you could say it looks like an iceberg. At least that's what I like to think. At this time, the boards that made up the rough stock for the sides and the inner walls were already dry, so I went ahead to the porch and unclamped everything. And the last board was the bottom one. I'm starting to remove the glue and plane away, make sure that I have an even surface. This was great cardio as well, and I can't wait to make a proper workbench in order to plane away. Well, not all the time, but you get what I'm saying. Then I just smoothed everything out with number 4 plane. I'm starting to trim everything so I get a better idea of the components. And for that I used a mini track saw for my circular saw.
This works as it should.
Here I planed the board that will start making up the stock for the face frame and the back frame. With a test piece I made sure I was right at 1.5 inches in width overall. I'm starting to carefully lay out my pieces and trim them at the radial arm saw. I clamped the pocket hole jig in my Black & Decker Workmate, and this was something that I guess I should have figured out before, but hey, it works quite well. And equipped with my shop vac, I basically had no wood chips flying around. Here I start to mount the frames with glue and pocket hole screws. I actually did a test off camera.
Screw in to secure the other end of the fence and
Just set the sides and up the fence. Do that on the tables on this piece.
The more and more I use these I-beams, I realize how versatile they are.
It was sharp again. It went to the wood. Or the center line is all of it now.
I'm just pre-sanding everything to about 220 grit. And if you're wondering, well, you're already planing them and smoothing them. I just wasn't satisfied enough, so I went ahead and sanded everything. Here I'm marking the dados, that being my choice of putting together the inner walls, the side walls, and the 3 horizontal surfaces. Here I'm just trimming away the outer walls, as well as the horizontal top, middle, and bottom shelves.
To be an example of what the sport should be. If you don't, okay, so if it's unhealthy, then why don't you be the example?
At this point, I set up my track saw and trimmed away the bigger panels.
Did with the cinder block, I would dig down 42 inches.
there was a sequence in assembling this credenza, and I thought about it beforehand. It would start from top to bottom and vice versa throughout the dry assembly and the final glue up.
You'll typically get a nice photo.
I'm just cutting a scrap, making sure that I had the right depth of the dado.
There are many more. These are the three that I had in the shop. This is a standard. This will drill.
It can, but if it's only a 3, that's also, like, I think we overestimate.
Assembling things was really easily once I made these right angle clamping assistants, I guess you can call them.
Then there's or even just understanding.
Here I'm just setting up some straight edges to route out the dados on the bigger surfaces. Here I'm cutting the height of the middle dividers and I'm dry fitting them.
I'm going to deepen the problems.
What I'm doing here is I took a narrower scrap piece from my resawing earlier and I'm trimming away these small strips to replace my biscuits.
This sawing requires us.
Instead of using biscuits and routing out the small channel where they go, I made grooves, but not throughout the entire length of the face frame, rather more like about 7 inches.
You should get square automatic. Because it's a teacher, they were probably stuck. So this can't be tight. I can now.
At this point, it's worth mentioning that all grain goes in the same direction in this entire build. The inner walls, the longer panels, the outside walls, even the legs. There is one exception, but I'll talk about that later.
Shows and winning the Arnold, and the rest is history, so to speak. Self-hoops walking around because they feel good about it. Or congrats about anything that you did, like bodybuilding is about pushing heavy weights. Now, some people it might, I'm sure guys are eating. Why? Because your body produces, and we've talked about, you want to do a 50 gram carb.
Let's go to Jonathan Kitmarchik. They wanted a hypocaloric
You
diet.
need more food, and of course it feels better. I laugh and get used to it, and I wouldn't be for a reason or another. I don't know. Calf heads, the 2 gastrocnemic tracts as well. So, I'm going to turn it into a handle, breathing apparatus. Now when I do this, I want it angled.
some clamping pressure and let it dry overnight. In this shot you can actually see how the face frame and back frame adds a unifying thickness, almost like an illusion, when seen from the front to the inner walls and the outside walls as well. I'm starting to shape everything. I wanted to make sure that when you actually touch it, there are no sharp edges. There is a slight elevation, but a very rounded, nice to the touch feeling.
Was there a message?
Of the doubt, like maybe, hey, I'll find something good, you know what?
Here I'm just trimming away the rectangles that add support for the wing, and I'm attaching them with dowels.
Post-workout, you know, because they're over the rest of the day. That would work rather than you should throw the mix too, but you know, let's say you take running for instance. It's the set of squats with, you know, 600 pounds.
I had some leftover veneer from my resawing earlier, and I decided to repeat the iceberg design on the front end of the Credenza. Basically just glued everything and clamped it very well and let it dry. And then afterwards I shaped it so everything just sort of blended in. I'm starting to cut away the stock for my 8 legs. All it took was 2 parallel clamps and some glue. This is the part where I mentioned where almost everything went in the same direction. There is a drawer that holds the record player, and I knew that I was going to run into a problem when I was going to make the core of the drawer out of solid wood. So instead of that, so there was no expansion and contraction over time, I went ahead and used a piece of birch plywood and basically applied small strips to make up a thicker veneered surface. The strength of this was just the same, since it wasn't a structural piece and the integrity was more than enough. You can see me starting to square out the blocks that are soon to be my tapered legs. This is the mortise square stock. And then I carefully laid out everything, clamped it into my workmate, and laid out the mortise. After that, I made sure that they were square, and I started working on the tapered legs, cutting out the tenon on the table saw first. I'm just chamfering the bottoms of them and sanding them away. After the veneer was dried on the plywood, I trimmed it all away and made sure that everything was smooth. I guess you can call this more of a shelf, a sliding shelf than a drawer, because it has very narrow walls. Here I'm starting to cut out the outer parts of it. Then I'm starting to place all the parts next to each other, making sure that everything is trimmed at the right height, right length. I'm basically making an L shape for the outer walls to cover the door slides. And the front and back are just two pieces of 3/4 inch beech wood. Over at the router table, I installed a small cove bit and started to shape something that made it look like a incorporated drawer pull. Here I'm just creating the joining surfaces in order to put the entire shelf together. After I taped everything, I removed it very slowly, went over to my workmate and applied glue, and then flipped it over and tacked it in place.
And get some sort of a circuit template, use a guide bushing and scrape it.
Afterwards, I was getting everything level and smooth, and I started pre-mounting the door slides. They would eventually come off so I can finish the entire credenza, but I wanted to make sure that all the holes and everything was fitting right beforehand.
The other direction, it is right at 5 belts or any other variable like that. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I am watch you. Remember, one last thing after everything's said.
Formatic. The gold standard since 19.
I decided to add a small little detail inside the shelf. Probably will never be seen, but just a small, I guess you can call it a trim piece. Here I'm doing the final sanding before I went ahead and applied the pre-stain conditioner. It was such a pleasing moment once I got to see the grain, even though it was going to be darker because I ended up staining it in a cherry stain. The pre-stain conditioner did its job and cut down a lot on the absorption, which would have been rather ununiform on beech wood. And here you can see me applying the stain. I kind of worked on localized area since it was such a big piece, making sure I had a clock in my head knowing when to wipe off.
4 years ago.
And here I'm starting to attach the legs to the mortise squares, and afterwards I'm applying the coats of finish. They went with a satin finish and I myself liked it very much. The final step was just 1500 sandpaper with a slight pass that gave it that uniform, very nice to the touch feeling. Here I'm just making these oblong holes in order to deal with any type of wood movement under the credenza.
Right? And it's something to say to that, especially as I, sit back and, muscles or ripped abs, there's deprivation, and just so much to offer, I believe, guys like us, who love the discipline, the structure of bodybuilding training. Oh, I'm a one guy, you eat,
I hope you enjoy this project, and I'm looking forward to your comments and your observations. If you like my content in general, you can go ahead and subscribe the button down below. And whether you watch this whole episode in its entirety or just skip right through it, my wish is that you walk away with some sort of added information, maybe some entertainment, but most importantly, inspiration. Everyone have a great rest of the week, and I will see you next time.